Welcome to another edition of Magic Gaming Esports Academy webinar series presented by Florida Blue. I'm Kendra Douglas. And today we have a pretty special episode because we are talking to Elisa Huang, Freelance Tournament Director. Elisa, thank you for joining us. How are you?
I'm fantastic. Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
I'm just going to dive right in and let's just talk a little bit about how you got into this gaming world. Give us a little bit of your backstory and just, how you got to where you are today.
Yeah. Um, Back in the day, I was a Counter-Strike competitor. So this was, wow, 1.3. So this is about, I think, like early 2000s, of showing my age. And I really enjoyed gaming at the time. It was like just a fun thing to bond with my friends. And when I discovered Counter-Strike, I was like, I'm really into this game. I want to start competing. And so my friends and I formed a clan, and we were competing for quite a while. Over time, it was hard for me to focus on school, and to my parents and Asian culture especially, it's so important. So I kind of started diving off of that and just started going back to school. And I think around that time, esports also wasn't as the opportunities aren't as prevalent as they are now. So fully focused on school, and then I ended up going to college for business. And I just took quite of a bit of a break from esports for a while. I still like loved playing, and I still stayed as like a sub for my team, but my focus was on school for a very long time. And then I went to business school and I started working in the finance world. And I realized I hated it. And so I had to work on the transition out of it just because I had so much experience in it. And I think that for a little while I was pigeonholed.
Mhm.
Um, and there was this gaming store that opened near my parents' place in Brooklyn. And originally from New York, shout out to New York. Um, and I was just kind of like plunged back into the gaming space, and now I see there's more players. There's even like a game store, and I really was made a lot of friends that way. And I decided, this is. I think coming out of college, a lot of people get a little lost because they're like, "Oh, I majored in this, but is this really what I want to do?" And I decided to, finance wasn't where I wanted to be, and kind of this hanging out with these people and just being in that environment again reignited my passion for
Mhm.
gaming and competition. And I applied for a job at Riot Games, which took me out to California. I was a talent coordinator there, which is specifically more like in the human resources world. But I knew that ultimately I wanted to go back into competition. This was my opportunity to use the experience I had to turn the way into composition whenever I saw the opportunity. And I would say that Riot was very good about providing opportunities for people who wanted to test out other areas of disciplines. And so they were asking if anybody was interested in being a LCS referee. So that's their professional league. And I volunteered and I became a referee. And that was my first time that I really got to immerse myself in the competitive space. I mean, it's live shows, it's, pro players and everything. And so I really loved that. And I knew that that was the route I wanted to take. And ultimately, I ended up at Face It. And this time around, my job title was specifically in esports and competition. And I learned a lot there. Started off as a coordinator, became ultimately a tournament director there, and then ultimately at EE, and now I'm freelance.
That is so awesome. I want to go all the way back to kind of like that moment where you realized you wanted to transition back into the gaming world. What was that like what was the conversations like to, and was it hard? I know that you applied, but like were you constantly applying to jobs just to kind of get back in? And was it a little bit challenging? Is it one of those things where it was like once you knew you could get into the door, things could open? Like how was that moment for you?
Yeah, I think that it took me a little while to figure out because I wasn't sure specifically where I wanted to be, but I knew I wanted to be in gaming. And around this time, I was attending fighting game events. I love fighting games. It's one of the first games I played was Street Fighter, and I would keep an eye on the tournament directors. In fighting game community, it's smaller and it's more, like I said, community based.
Mhm.
So tournament directors are more accessible. You can talk to them. Everybody's just really friends, and I would watch them and talk to them about their experience and the things that they're doing. And I decided that's really interesting. It's my way of still being in the competitive space and being in there without actually competing myself. Because at this point, I was a little too over that. I don't have those reflexes anymore. Um, but I would say that the tournament directors in that space were very kind to me, and because they knew I wanted to gain more experience, they allowed me a lot of opportunities to learn straight from them, and I'll always be grateful for that. And when I started applying, I would say it wasn't necessarily easy because tournament ops is a very niche field within esports. You have like marketing, you have socials, you have all those things, and tournament ops. I I personally feel like nobody really goes into tournament ops unless you're specifically very interested in competition operations, working with players, dealing with players, and just building the competition, which is, I think, personally, is my favorite part. You get to um, see all your ideas come to life. And I love that part about it. So it wasn't easy, but I knew that the smartest way to go about it, at least in my opinion, was to find opportunities in spaces that I had some experience and then just try to build from there, make my connections and network. And yeah, it's been very great.
That's awesome. The other thing that stood out to me, of course, and I mentioned this before, is referee. I mean, can we talk a little bit about just how you were a referee and a talent coordinator, but specifically the parts of like having to like go through that journey? I mean, like how fun was it? How cool was it? Was it just one of those things where you were kind of like, if this is what's gonna take to still be in this and have something, under my belt, let's do it.
Yeah. When they first made the announcement, actually, you had to go through a quiz to make sure you actually studied the rules, which is so important. Being a referee, because you are there, you are the first line of defense to enforce these rules. And it was a little nerve wracking because it was on stream. And I'm not used to being on camera, but it was a great opportunity for me to learn from, I would say, the most basic level of tournament operations. I think that it's important to be able to understand what that point of view is like, because ultimately, if you are trying to climb from there, decisions that you will make are going to affect your team. I think it's important to know what they're facing in their moment, why they may make a decision that they're making, and it just makes you a better manager overall.
Yeah. Now, you've been able to just accomplish so much from your resume. I mean, it's so fun to kind of read more into it. But what was your experience like as a esports manager and in that role?
Yeah. At that point, you start working with the sponsors, like the companies that are sponsoring these players more. You're talking to the team managers, sometimes even like directors or higher executives from those organizations. And you have to be very professional. You have to understand things from their perspective. And I would say being an esports manager, but growing from someone who was a coordinator and a referee, you have a way better perspective. And that's why I think it's so important to be able to build that experience from the bottom up, because the decisions you're making, you are taking everybody's point of view and their needs and their wants into consideration. And I would say that being esports manager is realistically not easy because you are the person that has to manage a lot of expectations. You are the go-to person when things needs to be escalated, and so I think that being calm, taking your time to consider your decisions before you make them is very, very important.
Kinda like the bad guy in a way. Like you kinda have to be like, yeah, a little bit. How did you kinda guide yourself into that role? Is that kind of a leadership role that you even thought you could even do or even be a part of or thought that esports could even have?
Yeah, I mean, I think that at the time and back when I was competing, there were team managers just because you needed somebody to wrangle all the players, right? But, being someone that is managing competitions at this level, I think at that time, when I was competing and I thought one day I would love to work in this field, but I didn't know where it was. And you didn't, I don't think that you imagined that one day this is going to be huge. You have multi-million dollar competitions and people are going to be watching worldwide with millions of viewers. At least I didn't imagine that. And it's great to be able to see what it was become what it is today. And it's sometimes you kind of just got to sit back and really think, wow, it's grown, and I've been lucky enough to be able to see that growth.
Is there I wanna go back to, like, just some of the things that you like, the game the competitions. Is there one that, like, stood out to you that you're just kinda like, we really made this happen, or like that has continued to always be an example of what you use when you work with other groups? Like, is there one that stands out to you the most?
Yes, absolutely. It was the CS:GO major. Being someone who competed back in my day, being someone who competed, it was so surreal to be able to run a competition of that caliber. So that's the highest level of competition for Counter Strike. And from a player to being someone who was a part of running the event was a huge deal to me. I remember very specifically watching the opening ceremony, and I started crying because it just felt so surreal that this was something that I was able to accomplish that I never even thought about at that time. And I felt like 14-year-old me would be so proud because you don't think that, first of all, you don't think about seeing esports grow to that extent. But not just that, now you're, even though you can't compete anymore, you just don't want to compete anymore, you're able to still be a part of the competition and now run the events for the next generation of professional players.
Do you think that, like, if 14-year-old you were, like, here now, like, do you think you would still be competing? Like, do you think, like, knowing what's happened now, knowing how much it's grown, like, do you think that you kind of be like, "No, no, mom and dad, like, this actually
I would
can
love to
happen?"
still compete. I would have absolutely loved to still be competing. Sometimes I see, all the benefits and the things that players have now. I'm like, man, not in my day. I, I wish I stayed.
Yeah, right? Like, you can see all the streamers and stuff like that too, or, like, playing, you're just like, "I could be making thousands, like, you could be doing so much."
I'm like, damn, I wish.
I know. I know. Yeah, it's so interesting to kinda think about, like, I love asking this question of, like, can you imagine, like, can you believe where esports is now today compared to when you were, like, getting into it? So, I'll ask you that, like, tell me just a little bit about just the field and seeing where it is now when you joined too. Like, how much has it grown? How much has it changed in your eyes?
Yeah, when I joined, it was, I think you saw like a few big games. Like you had the Counter Strike, the League of Legends, at Riot, and this is before Fortnite even was a thing. And Fortnite is one of the hugest games as well. Just the expansion into also mobile gaming and console gaming has been around forever as well. But just the different areas that you can go into, the types of games, and just seeing the like. This is when the phones were just, was it like the T1 or the T9 when you're texting,
Oh,
and
yes. Yes,
and
yes,
then now
yes.
you have full-on competitions for mobile gaming. I just recently did an event at Twitch. Oh well, during TwitchCon, it was for Samsung, and it was specifically for PUBG Mobile. And it was a great event. There was a lot of influencers. Everybody was very happy. It was really, really fun. But I would have never thought about, a whole competition on cell phones. But that's just, the mobile gaming industry is continuously growing with this
Mhm.
current generation, and never would have thought about running a video game on phones, right? So it's changed a lot, but it's still, I think the consistency of it is that you bring, like, one about my favorite things about esports and gaming in general is and I think this is like with sports too, and I love sports, so it's very similar in this aspect that you bring people together that you probably would have otherwise never met in your life.
Mm.
And I love that. It's the love for gaming, the love for sports is a very international thing, and I think that's amazing.
Yeah, it really is. Where do you, and this is a loaded question, but where do you see the world of esports going now and, like, transitioning now, or what do you think is going to happen within the next 5 years to, like, the esports world?
Yeah, I think that there's a high probability of it becoming more and more similar to actually the sports world. You see that in organizations who have or competitions that have multi-sponsored tournaments, right? Like NBA2K, Overwatch. You just have all these big companies that are sponsoring into it, and then you have professional leagues, and you have buy-ins from these organizations. So I see that continue being the field and growing in that aspect more and more.
Mhm. Let's talk a little bit about kind of like your freelancing moment. What exactly have you been able to accomplish? And have you realized that there is so much more in this world too now that you can do and you can kind of dabble in a little bit more?
Yeah. So being freelance, I think gives you more opportunities in terms of working with other companies. Typically when you're working with a publisher, you're only working with their games. And then when you are specifically working at one company, it's just whatever opportunities they bring in, whatever bids they win. But when you are more freelance, you get to kind of dabble in everything. And you're not tied to just one game or just, one company. And there's a lot more things that you get to learn, a lot more freedom in terms of decision making that you get. And I think it's a great feeling that you get a lot more trust because you're answering to kind of the creative director. There's directions they want to go, but you get a lot more freedom in creating competitions and or just being creative in general. And I love that part. I love one of my favorite things about competition ops is building the competition format itself. And so when you are freelance, you just get a lot more freedom
Yeah.
to be more creative.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about some of the projects you've been able to like do so far?
Yeah. One of the more recent projects that I've been, excuse me, consistently working on is with the Navy. And this is through OS Studios, but it's their Navy Wounded Warrior program as well as their MWR, which I believe is it's mental health welfare. And I forget the last one. Sorry. And it's you get to work with people who are either veterans and or family members of relatives of veterans and also active duty members.
Mhm.
And I think that that's a great thing that they've developed because it's a space that allows them to military people can be gamers too, and just kind of have a more fun space, relax, just be competitive with each other. So it's been great. I've had quite a few events with them, and it's been really, really fun. Players are great. And then the Samsung event that I did this past weekend was fun. Just kind of get to meet all these influencers, which is always great. That you kind of get to talk to them and get their insight about their life, which is so interesting.
Yeah.
Streaming for your career is so interesting. I'm a private person. I couldn't do it, and it's shout outs to them that they're able to kind of just broadcast themselves into the world because we all know how crazy it can be. And but it was a very fun event, and I've gotten a lot of freedom and a lot of trust from people I've worked with, so that's been a great confidence booster.
I'm so curious to kind of get your idea too, like being able to be around all those streamers and those influencers. Do you feel like, did you ever one imagine that that could be the world that we live in of where they have such great power, but then also kind of like seeing how they've become such big influencers now, like how do they, I guess, in your mind, how do they help continue, I guess, to grow the gaming area world too? And do you see it continuing to be a bigger thing in a way?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the people that we see are actually former professionals themselves, and they've either like retired or they felt that they liked being an influencer more. And it's really like, for example, Nicewig was the co-streamer, so we were basically broadcasting the primary broadcast of his stream, which has a huge following. So it's them that's helping build the space a lot now. They have all these people that really enjoy them, and maybe people who have never known about these games had they not been following this specific influencer. So I think that the marketing aspect of it is huge, huge with them. And what's great about them though is actually it's interesting to see the personality switch. A lot of people are actually very more quiet, and they're very, very nice. And so yeah, some of the streamers, their personality is just so different from what they are, and it's basically an actor, right? You kind of like it's a switch you're turning on and off, and it's very to see some of them very more demure and more shy when they're talking to you. But it's fun to see. It's fun to interact with.
That's so funny and so it's so real. So the biggest part that we love talking about here too is mental health. But the first thing I want to also mention is like being a woman in this field. What were some of the challenges that you have been able to overcome? And what advice would you give to women gamers who are going to be watching this and are listening to everything you're saying?
Yeah. That's a great question. I would say that for one, discrimination is a very real thing. It
Mm,
happens, and I'm not going to sugarcoat it like it doesn't. But I will say that there are more people who are not like that, at least in my experience, than there are. Unfortunately, a lot of discrimination may be something you're putting on yourself. Not to say that it doesn't happen, but more, I think it comes with the territory of being a woman in esports, basically being somewhere similar to sports where it's male dominated. You will, there will be things that you will say that will be maybe taken a certain way, and you'll have to be more self-aware of the things that you say or the way you act, simply because it's going to be viewed differently sometimes.
Mhm.
um, and so there's a pressure that you're probably going to end up putting on yourself, that you have to prove yourself, or you have to be a very certain way, and it's something that eventually you will have to grow out of, because I think that ultimately it will restrict you from growing to where you can possibly be. And I'm very guilty of that myself. I think that for a long time, I struggled with thinking, oh, I have to prove myself. And so I put this unnecessary amount of pressure on myself. And then a little mistake, and you suddenly lose your confidence. And it happens all the time. But I've been very lucky enough that I've worked with a lot of people, a lot of men who have been very encouraging, and I did not get discriminated against. So there are great people out there, and I think a lot of it is just being able to um, be more confident in yourself, and building, then knowing that like imposter syndrome is always going to be trying to creep on you, but
Yeah.
then you'll remember, like, I got this. And like this past event was something I hadn't done. I hadn't ran a LAN event in a year, and this past event really helped me rebuild my confidence. But a part of it was having a great team and having people who really support me, helped me rebuild my confidence. So I would say that find a space, or find people that are really just genuine, and that support you, because I think having that support system is extremely important.
Kind of continuing with that, do you feel like it's growing, the population of women gamers is continuing to grow, and do you think that this is something where, we won't even have to have that conversation one day in a way? Do you think we could get there?
Uh, I think for a long time, unfortunately, and this is not to say it's not to be disrespectful at all. Women were pushed to be towards hosting, being like an MC. But then now more and more you see more analysts, and you have your competitors as well. But a lot of times they have their own competitive space, which I understand why it needs to be that way. But I see it growing more and more out of that, where they're competing in the like the open tournaments, which is more male dominated.
Mm.
But I would say that it's getting there, and I think that we need more women in this space anyway. So please come.
Join. What do you
Please
think are
join.
some, right? What do you think are some misconceptions of esports that people think of?
Oh, great question. I think that it's a lot of people think, oh, it's just funding games. And yeah, it is funding games, but there's like there's a lot of professionalism that I think people ignore, or they don't pay enough attention to, and it ends up hurting them. I always joke around and I say, what those the memes are like what people think it is and what it actually is. So for
Mm.
competition operations, I always joke that what people think it is just playing video games, hanging out with players, and watching video games. And yes, it is all of those things, but it's also playing video games to understand what bugs there may be, what could hinder a competition, what could give a competitive advantage. Hanging out with players is wrangling them into competition, getting them onto stage on time, getting them to start, getting them into lobby. It's all of that. And watching video games, yeah, it is. But watching video games is watching for any issues that can appear on stream. Listening to players to make sure that they're staying PG. If you are doing a more like a younger age friendly, you have more like younger audience. It's watching for scores, and you're just hyper. This is literally what I did last week. I was so hyper focused because I didn't want to mess up the scoring. This is all live data that we're broadcasting, right? It's the graphics. So it's that, but it's also all these other things. It's understanding that, and I think some people don't think about it this way, but because it's gaming, there's a big casual aura about it, but you are working with companies who are spending a lot of money. So it's a very professional space as well. And you have to be able to understand that there is maybe like a switch you have to turn on. You have to understand that this is also a very professional space, and it's not all fun and games.
We talked a little bit about just one of the competitions that stands out to you the most and that you remember. Is there a competition that I guess was the most challenging to, continue to work through, but it went off really well, but I guess in the beginning you guys were like, "How are we gonna do this?" Was there ever a moment where you've had those?
Yeah, it was actually last year. It was a Pokemon Unite event. It was Worlds. One it was in Japan, and so which is a great opportunity. It was Japan is amazing. But there was more players than the year before, so more teams were qualified. We had a limited amount of space, so we had less space than before. So it was building the schedule for them, like a practice space. So building that schedule, building the A and B stream schedule, and then also there were quite a few incidents that happened where teams had to lose, were forced, like they were forfeited because of
Mm.
something, a rule that they broke, or a player just acting really crazy, or saying something disrespectful to another player. So it's managing those expectations and enforcing the rules on those things. So I will say that that was probably one of the most challenging and biggest events that I was a part of running. So it was it was memorable.
Can you talk a little bit more about just how it was well executed though, or like how just the end result, I guess, kinda you guys looked back and you were like, "We did this some way, somehow."
Yeah, we had a great team. I think that's important, understanding, or knowing who can really help you take an event to the next level. And I would say that it was honestly due to having a great team that you were able to do that. Same thing with the Samsung event. I had a fantastic team, and they made me look good. They made themselves look good. They made our creative director look good to the clients. So it's important to have people who have the ability to match your work, like your workflow and your wavelength when you're at events. And keeping those people close, because they're not easy to find, I would say.
Yeah. A lot of the people who will be watching this are younger viewers. So, what advice would you give them? We'll start off with those who might want to be in the professional world. And since you've had to work with a lot of professionals, what advice would you give to them about going about becoming a professional in this space?
Oof, wow. Um, I would say that there is a lot of pressure, and you have to be able to manage that. It's not just playing, you know, 12, 13 hours a day of gaming, right? It's of all the people that are playing this one specific game, less than 1% of them will be able to become a professional, right? It's networking, right? Because you could be one of the best players in the world, but if nobody knows you exist, you're not going to get sponsored. But I would say understanding and managing pressure is one of the hardest things that I've seen players deal with. There have been people that I know that have been professional level players, but they couldn't handle the pressure, and so they quit, right? I remember specifically had a conversation with a player who was, and I just had the time that day, but he happened to message me. He created a ticket in our Discord server, and he was just talking about giving up and how he just couldn't deal with this pressure anymore, and he was just very unhappy. And I just said to him, hey, if you want to stay in the competitive space, you're going to have to find a way to manage it, because it's as you grow, the pressure will only get worse, because there are tons of players who will be trying to take your spot. And
Yeah.
that's, I think, the most realistic thing to put out there and think about. There is always somebody waiting to take your spot. It's like sports in that aspect. And ultimately he didn't quit, and then he transitioned to Pokemon Unite, which is the next game I ended up working on, and he won world twice.
Oh,
So
nice.
it was great to see him just stick around and just kind of work through that himself and get to where he is now. So yeah, managing your expectations as well, because just because you are at that top level, teams may not necessarily be looking for that. I've seen plenty of players who join a team, and then they are put in a position where they're not used to playing in a certain style. Like maybe this team needs somebody that's more support based, and you're not that player, but that's the role they need to fill. And maybe you're not able to meet those expectations because that's not your style. And so I've seen players, kind of get dropped from teams because they couldn't transition to a different role.
Yeah. And then also, what advice would you give young viewers who possibly want to get into the field you're in?
Oh yeah. Find opportunities where you can be an admin. There are tons of opportunities to do online admin work. So in the comfort of your own home. And it will really help you get that experience that I think is important to have. Like I mentioned earlier, it's working with players, it's following directions, it's seeing what broadcast is like and the types of communication that needs to be had without actually having to be a part of it, right? And it's the quick turnarounds, the expectations that you need to meet as you grow in that space. But I would say being an admin is the very, very like most fundamental baseline. And there are typically tons more seasoned admins that are willing to teach and that are very kind, and you can ask them tons of questions. And I love when I have like new people come on and they want to get better and they ask me like, how do I do this? And it's always important that you are not afraid to ask a question, because I promise you no one is afraid to answer you. So it's you, because now this is another person that's growing, another person that you can probably bring on in the future that is willing to learn, which is I think is so important. When you are like managing a space, you want to see that people are willing to learn, because it means that they don't think that they're a know-it-all, and it means that they are always looking for opportunities to grow, which is what I love to see personally.
Yeah. One of the big things that we do with this webinar series is we talk about mental health. So, is there any opportunities, or is there anything you can talk about with mental health and how you prioritize it, but then also just mental health without this gaming field and where it needs to where it needs to grow a little bit?
Yeah. I would say esports and gaming, but very specifically esports for me is there's a big issue with burnout. I think that one of the biggest reasons for it is because um, a lot of people who are passionate about gaming, and this is not just them, but this is how I relate because that's who I am, and passionate about competition is you're working with games all day. And then you get off work and you're playing video games because you love video games, and that's great. But I think that it's important to understand that when you do that all the time, there is a certain level of overlap you're going to have with your work, right? And you end up being around it 24/7. You're thinking about it 24/7. And I'm very guilty of this myself, where I'm like, because I'm on Discord and the player happens to message me at 2 a.m. when I'm off the clock. Oh, you know what? It's a quick message. I can just answer him, right? And now you're working like 24 hours a day. And and like you won't realize in the beginning, but over time that will burn you out.
Mhm.
Just being around it constantly. I think a lot of times in other fields you're able to separate those things, but because you are in the field that you're also passionate about, because you're doing things that you already do at work, then you're just constantly around it and you don't realize it until one day you just don't care anymore and you're like, I can't be bothered to just talk to anybody about it. One of the things that I've learned to do is find a separate space that is completely irrelevant to game. Like I go swim, go outside for a walk. It's just taking yourself out of that environment. Just because you are a gamer and just because you're passionate about gaming, it doesn't mean it has to be 24/7. I think it's important to find hobbies outside of that space that just are, getting some fresh air. I think it's so important to do that. Getting the vitamin D. I'm so pale because I don't go outside, like you gotta go outside more. Getting the vitamin D is so important. Like I think that depression, anxiety is extremely something that happens all the time. And I would say that if you need the help, talk to somebody. I think that's so important. And just find something that you enjoy that's not just video games. And I think it's a great space, right? It's an outlet for a lot of people. But if you are also working in that space, it will overlap with just work, and your mind will be at work all the time. No, no, do other things that it's not work related. And I promise it'll benefit you in the long run.
Do you think that, speaking about mental health is something that needs to be brought up a little bit more within the esports kind of gaming world? Or do you think that it's slowly starting to kind of be brought up more?
Yeah, I think it's slowly starting to be brought up more. I think that there are like team psychologists as well in a lot of like the bigger organizations. So I think that they've taken it more seriously in this
Mhm.
like last maybe 5 years. And so players are getting better, but it's a big thing in the workspace as well. The one, you doing the competitions, doing the marketing, running all of that. I see companies more and more providing um, uh, membership or like just
Oh,
discounts to places like Headspace, for example. But I think that it's also important to do things as a team, as a company that are outside of that, right? Just the bonding part of it, especially now that there's so much remote opportunities. But being able to see other people, that you work with, be able to bond that way, or just doing like a company outing, something that's just completely irrelevant to what you're doing on a daily basis. It's nice.
yeah, yeah, definitely. I completely agree. Oh, sorry. Here we go. See, it always happens.
Yeah,
Someone trying to do me right when I'm like, luckily, it was like just towards the end. But this has been another edition of Magic Gaming Esports Academy webinar series. Before we let you go, Elisa, can you tell us how we can connect with you, contact you? How can we continue to how can people who view this continue to find you?
Yeah. So I have my Twitter. My DMs are open. That's Elisa Berry. So ELISABERRYYY. So that's three Y's. Or you can email me if you have questions, or you want like some mentorship, or just you have more questions about what I do. So that's Elisa, ELISA dot Wong, HUANG 72 at gmail.com.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today. And again, this has been another edition of Magic Gaming Esports Academy webinar series presented by Florida Blue. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to follow Magic Gaming at Magic Gaming on Twitter and on Instagram. Thank you again.